Hello, everybody. This is Richard Clark, and this is the second video in a series that I'll be doing in cooperation with the Easy Does It Club of Surrey, uh, and at the request of their education coordinator, Terry Wood. As I said in the first seminar, this is a general overview. Terry wanted me to cover a general overview of the material that's covered in my two books that are behind me. The green one is Spiritual Transformation. It's the third edition. And the blue book is the Addiction Recovery Handbook. It's the revised second edition. Second edition. And so uh, Terry read these. We've been spending several weeks now or months discussing them, and he thought they would be of value if there would be a general overview of the material in them to encourage people, whether professionals helping addicts or addicts seeking treatment or the management of treatment centers and recovery houses. It would be helpful if they could understand addictions from a different point of view of what I'm covering here. Then these are available through the publisher's website, which is friesenpress.com in Victoria, BC, or they're available on amazon.ca or amazon.com. So how I ended the first video was taking us up to the idea of going back to 1840 and discussing the history of addiction in North America. So, and this is all prompted by the drastic change in recovery programs and the sort of massive failure rate of people who are seeking addictions treatment, where the relapse rate is somewhere around 90 or 95%. And of course, from my point of view, it's important to have a better understanding of the psychology of addiction, which requires a lot of education so that we can deliver more effective services. And this 90 or 95% failure rate isn't really the fault of anyone. There's nobody to blame for it. We all just have to force ourselves to become more open-minded about understanding the social or religious or political persecution of addicts and how culture and society has changed, and that if you understand the psychology of addiction, then it's unnecessary to embrace a faith-based treatment. So let's go back to 1840. What happened in the United States around 1840 was the organization and creation of the Temperance Movement. And the short form of this is the Temperance Movement was a Protestant Christian evangelical organization that demonstrated a lot of the traits of a cult. And the Protestant Christian Evangelical Society, the Temperance Movement, lived with the idea and believed in the theory that all alcohol consumption, whether a lot of alcohol or a little alcohol or a moderate amount of alcohol, any alcohol consumption was a sin. And whoever drank was participating in moral turpitude. And they had a mission. The Temperance Movement had a mission. And they intended to create an alcohol-free society. They weren't interested in offering treatment to the hardcore alcoholics. They weren't interested in offering alternatives to people who were moderate drinkers. Their fundamental position was that if you drank alcohol to any degree, you were a sinner and had to therefore seek forgiveness from God for your own personal salvation in the evangelical movement of Protestant Christianity. Now, there was a lot of people who disagreed with that. But the movement, the temperance movement, gained a lot of adherents and participants. And over the next sort of 40, 45 years, it became a rather prominent social organization that had a lot of influence on social standards along the principally eastern seaboard of the United States. And what this led to was a lot of the pervasive belief that somehow drinking alcohol to any degree was morally corrupt. And this is a pervasive attitude that still filters into our consciousness today because it's never been properly addressed. I'll be bringing up some ideas about Bill Wilson and Alcoholics Anonymous in 1939 that tend to show this as true. So while the temperance movement is gaining social influence and political influence in the United States from about 1840, in about 1860 or 1865, there was this other thing that was developing. This is where we back up and start over. There was this other thing that was developing in the United States, and that was a very prominent and obvious addiction to laudanum, which was a combination of alcohol and powdered opium. It was 90% alcohol, about 10% powdered opium by weight. And the addiction, the power of developing an addiction to this was quite strong, but it was largely misunderstood until near the turn of the century, around 1900. So from about 1860 on, and by about 1875 or 1880, what we understood was that of the 100 million or so people in the United States by 1900, about 10% of the entire population were addicted to laudanum or variations of opium. And I mean, they don't talk about this very much, but there are estimates that in the American Civil War from 1860 to 1864, there were about 2 million ounces of opium distributed to Union soldiers for war wounds and trauma and all manner of health concerns. And that fed into the general availability of laudanum. By 1880 or 1885, there were several books published on how to use and consume laudanum, how to mix it with water and how much you should take. And I think the best way to try and understand this is, like today in 2020 and 2022, there are very few people in North America that have any hesitation to taking an aspirin or a Tylenol for a headache. Doctors freely recommend Tylenol for minor aches and pains and headaches. And so we don't have any compunction and we don't have any regrets about taking a couple of Tylenol if we have a headache. It's largely available. You can buy it in grocery stores, you can buy it in drugstores, you can buy it all over the place. Well, that attitude that we have today regarding Tylenol and headache pills was very similar to the attitude they had in 1880 or 1885 about consuming alcohol and opium in this mixture, this tincture called laudanum. Laudanum was available in apothecaries and drugstores. It was available in furniture stores. You could buy it in restaurants and grocery stores. And you didn't need any doctor's participation or prescription or approval. If you wanted it, you could just go buy it and take it. As I said, it was so popular that several books were written about how to consume laudanum, and it was principally used by women. Certainly it was sexist and unacceptable socially today, but in 1880 and 1885, women would take laudanum for having the vapors, which would be sort of like mild anxiety attacks. They would take laudanum for menstrual cramps. Women would take laudanum for being anxious or being angry or being dissatisfied. So anxiety disorders and menstrual cramps and headaches and vapors and hysteria were all treated by women taking laudanum. And of course, there were men that took laudanum for chronic pain or anxiety or anger. And by about 1885 or 1890, they realized that 10% of the American population were addicted to laudanum. And that's about 10 million people. Laudanum was recommended for mothers to give to colicky children. If your child was nervous or anxious or colicky or was teething and crying or upset, it was perfectly acceptable to give them a small dose of laudanum, opium, to calm them down. So, by 1890 or so, we've got 10 million people, principally in the east coast of the United States, that are addicted to laudanum. And of this, and this is an important statistic, of this 10 million people, about 60% were women and about 40% were men. So we have 6 million laudanum addicts that are women on the east coast of the United States, which will come into play a little bit later. So we have this massive addiction crisis to laudanum that is developing in the United States, Canada, England, and by about 1905, governments and doctors started to recognize this as an addiction crisis, and were taking steps to restrict access to it. They put labeling requirements on the bottle and manufacturing data on the bottle, and then it was restricted by doctor's prescription, and it was they restricted its availability as an over-the-counter remedy. It was all kinds of things they did. And by about 1915, it was largely unavailable, and by 1917, it was more or less against the law. Doctors wouldn't prescribe it, you couldn't get it. And that becomes significant a few years later. So while the temperance movement is developing its political clout in trying to convince all of the population of North America, and especially the Americans, trying to convince the population that drinking is a sin, we have this ever-developing laudanum dependency or opium dependency that's developing in the population of the United States. And so, by 1900, we have several 100,000 women that are involved in the temperance movement, and we have 6 million women that are addicted to laudanum. And certainly there's going to be some crossover where women who are addicted to laudanum are participating in the temperance movement. Now, there's a third thing that's confusing at this time that happens, which makes everything more complicated. Around 1880, there was the creation and the political correctness of the suffragette movement. And in the suffragette movement, what we were understanding is there was a very legitimate, authentic, and justified claim for women to acquire the vote. And women believed, and it was largely understood, that it was only a matter of time before the governments of the United States or Canada or England would correct this identified social injustice. So we have 3 groups of people now. We have the suffragettes, which are seen as politically correct and justified and ethical. We have about 6 million women who are addicted to laudanum and opium, and about 4 million men. And we have the temperance movement that has this sort of emotionally questionable idea that if you drink alcohol, it's a sin. And what happened was the number of women in the suffragette movement were contained within a number of women that are in the temperance movement. So we had this overlapping of membership. And what happened in the public's mind was the temperance movement, which had this questionable morality, where they saw that drinking was a sin. We saw that get attached to the suffragette movement, which was politically correct and socially wise and necessary. And so that joining of social issues, the temperance movement and the suffragette movement, gave the temperance movement some legitimacy that it didn't otherwise have. People started to see socially that the temperance movement was a valid and reasonable thing because in the mind of the general population it was associated to the suffragettes. And mixed in the middle of all of that, we have about 6 million opium addicts that are women and about 4 million opium addicts that are men. So that brings us up to sort of around 1915, 1917. We have the temperance movement that's gaining political clout because it's attached to the suffragette movement. The suffragette movement is getting ready for federal legislation to give them the vote. And we have about 10 million opium addicts wandering around the country that can't get their drug of choice. So that brings us up to about 1920, and which I'll bring up a little bit later. We have to remember that the two founders of Alcoholics Anonymous, Bill Wilson and Bob Smith, Bill Wilson was born in 1895, and Bob Smith was born in 1879. And both of these people would have been raised and indoctrinated into the political chaos of the temperance movement, where drinking was a sin, the Protestant evangelical movement, which was gaining strength, the political correctness and necessity of giving women the vote. And they would have been raised in a society where approximately 10% of the adult population were addicted to opium through laudanum. And that didn't account for the millions of other people who would probably be addicted to alcohol. That's a part of the next video. The video number 3 is I'll be getting into understanding how this confluence of dysfunction created a whole bunch of serious problems in the 1920s and 1930s. So thank you for listening this far, and the next one is video 3 about the jazz age, the social problems, the depression, and how we ended up with Alcoholics Anonymous. So thanks for listening, and have a nice day.